Hi there, welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight we're going to explore what scientists now call the single worst year to be alive in recorded human history. Picture this. You wake up one morning in the year 536, stretch your arms, and notice something's off. The sun. That reliable golden orb that's greeted humanity every morning since the dawn of time has transformed into a pale, sickly disk, barely visible through a thick, sulphurous haze. You rub your eyes, thinking maybe you're still dreaming. But no, this is your new reality. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive the next decade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, let's drift back in time. You stumble out of your dwelling, whether it's a Byzantine villa, a Chinese farmhouse, or a Germanic longhouse doesn't matter because this catastrophe is playing out simultaneously across the entire planet. The temperature has already dropped several degrees from yesterday, and it's the middle of what should be summer. Your neighbors are gathered in confused clusters, pointing at the dim orb above, whispering about angry gods and the end of days. Nobody knows it yet, but this mysterious fog will persist for a full 18 months, plunging the entire world into what we now call the late antique Little Ice Age. The first thing you notice after the darkened sun is the smell, a sharp, acrid stench that burns your nostrils and makes your eyes water. It's like someone set fire to every rotten egg in existence and mixed it with the essence of despair. Modern scientists analyzing Greenland ice cores have identified this as sulfur dioxide, the calling card of one of history's most devastating volcanic eruptions. But you don't know about volcanic gases or atmospheric chemistry. All you know is that breathing suddenly requires effort, and every inhale tastes like death itself decided to take up residence in your lungs, your crops, which just yesterday showed promising green shoots, are already beginning to wilt. The temperature drop is so severe that frost forms in July, in the Mediterranean. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine palm trees in Italy covered in ice, olive groves frozen solid, and wine grapes shriveling on vines that have thrived for centuries. Historians still argue whether the agricultural collapse happened within weeks or took months to fully manifest, but the end result remains undisputed: a complete and total failure of food production across 3 continents. Here's a quirky detail that somehow makes it worse. Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from Constantinople, described the sun as giving no more light than the moon. But get this, he was being optimistic. Tree ring data from Scandinavia shows that some trees simply stopped growing that year. Not slower growth, not stunted growth. They just stopped, like nature itself hit the pause button. Some Swedish trees show no growth ring at all for 536, creating what dendrochronologists call missing years in the wood. Imagine being a tree and deciding conditions are so bad you'll just skip this year entirely. As you stand there in the gloom, watching your breath fog in what should be summer heat, you have no idea that somewhere far away, possibly in Iceland, possibly in Indonesia, though scientists still debate the exact location, a massive volcano has just vomited millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. This isn't your garden variety eruption. This is what volcanologists classify as a VEI-6 or possibly VEI-7 event, powerful enough to inject aerosols into the upper atmosphere, where they'll circulate globally for years. To put that in perspective, when Mount Centaur, Helen's Blue in 1980, that was merely a VEI 5, and it devastated hundreds of square miles. This eruption is 10 to 100 times more powerful. The volcanic winter that descends upon you isn't some localized disaster. It's a planetary catastrophe that makes modern climate change look like a mild inconvenience. You're living through what geologists would later identify as one of the most severe volcanic cooling events in the last 2 millennia, triggered by an eruption so massive that scientists are still arguing about which volcano was responsible. The leading candidates: either Ilopango in El Salvador, which definitely erupted around this time with civilization-ending force, or an Icelandic volcano whose identity remains frustratingly anonymous in the geological record. Some researchers even suggest it might have been multiple eruptions in quick succession, a volcanic 1-2 punch that knocked Earth's climate system completely off balance. You watch as the perpetual twilight transforms everything familiar into something alien and threatening. The ash particles suspended in the atmosphere are so fine they can remain airborne for years, each microscopic fragment acting like a tiny mirror reflecting sunlight back into space. It's essentially planetary sunscreen, except nobody ordered it, and the SPF is somewhere around 10,000. The temperature drops by about 2.5 degrees Celsius globally, which might not sound catastrophic until you realize that's an average. In some regions, particularly in Northern Europe and Asia, summer temperatures plummet by up to 4 degrees Celsius. That's the difference between a harvest and a famine, between survival and starvation. Here's where it gets properly weird. Chinese chronicles from the period describe yellow dust falling like snow, accumulating on surfaces and mixing with actual snow to create a grimy, sulfurous slush. This wasn't regular dust. Chemical analysis of ice cores confirms it was volcanic ash enriched with sulfur compounds, essentially acid snow. Imagine trying to explain to your kids why the snow burns their skin and kills plants on contact. The Beishi Chronicle matter-of-factly records that yellow dust rained down like snow, and that it could be scooped up in handfuls, which is simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. You're not just dealing with darkness and cold, though. The volcanic aerosols are creating spectacular optical phenomena that would be beautiful if they weren't harbingers of doom. The few glimpses of sun you get are blood red, surrounded by halos and strange luminous rings. Medieval chroniclers describe multiple suns appearing in the sky, a phenomenon called sundogs caused by ice crystals in the volcanic haze at night, when there should be stars. You see instead an eerie greenish glow, like the sky itself is sick. Modern atmospheric physicists recognize these as classic signs of stratospheric aerosol loading, but to you, it's proof that the world is ending. The eruption's effects cascade through every system on Earth. Ocean temperatures drop, disrupting currents and weather patterns. The Asian monsoon, that life-giving seasonal rain system that billions depend on, well, millions in your time, weakens dramatically or fails entirely. In China, the Nanxi Chronicle records that the stars were lost from view for 3 months. Not poetic exaggeration, but literal truth. The volcanic fog is so thick that even bright stars can't penetrate it. Ships at sea report being unable to navigate, their captains reduced to guessing direction by wind and wave when neither sun nor stars are visible for weeks at a time. What makes this volcanic winter particularly devastating is its timing. Many regions were already struggling with local conflicts, economic instability, or previous poor harvests. The eruption doesn't just bring its own problems, it amplifies every existing vulnerability. It's like nature decided to kick humanity while it was down, then keep kicking for good measure. Historians still debate whether the eruption caused the cascade of disasters that followed, or merely triggered an avalanche that was already poised to fall. But from your perspective, academic distinctions matter less than the immediate reality of a world suddenly hostile to human life. The truly disturbing part: this isn't even the worst of it. Unknown to you, trembling in the volcanic twilight of 536, another massive eruption will strike in 540, refreshing the atmospheric ash layer just as it begins to clear. It's like getting punched in the face while you're still recovering from the first blow. Some scientists studying Antarctic ice cores have found evidence of a third eruption around 547, suggesting that the entire decade was punctuated by volcanic violence. You're not living through a bad year, you're at the beginning of a bad decade, possibly the worst decade in recorded human history. As you huddle in your dimmed world, surrounded by dying crops and panicking neighbors, you can't possibly comprehend the global scale of this disaster. But whether you're in Constantinople watching the emperor's granaries empty, in China recording the failure of the harvest, or in Scandinavia watching trees refuse to grow, you're part of a shared human experience of catastrophe that transcends all boundaries of culture, language, and geography. The volcano has made everyone equal in misery. You're standing in what used to be your field, staring at crops that look like they've aged 50 years in 5 weeks. The wheat stalks are brittle and grey, snapping at the slightest touch. The barley has simply given up, lying flat against the ground as if bowing in surrender to this new, hostile world. Even the weeds, those indestructible botanical cockroaches that normally thrive on neglect, are withering away. It's agricultural apocalypse, and you're watching it unfold in real time across every farm, garden, and orchard from Ireland to Japan. The temperature drop has turned summer into a grotesque parody of winter. In China, the Wade dynasty records show that snow fell in August, in regions where August snow was about as common as flying pigs. You're experiencing what modern climatologists call a year without summer, except unlike the famous 1816 version that would come 12 centuries later. This one lasts much longer and cuts much deeper. Frost forms nightly, even in traditionally warm regions, in the Mediterranean, where people have grown olives and grapes for millennia. Ancient vines that survived countless wars and droughts are freezing to death from the inside out. Here's a detail that really drives home the horror. Archaeologists studying sites from this period often find evidence of desperate agricultural experimentation. You and your neighbors are trying everything, planting cold-resistant crops from northern regions, attempting to grow food in sheltered microenvironments, even trying to cultivate typically inedible plants. In Britain, evidence suggests people attempted to grow turnips and other root vegetables in place of grains, while in China, records indicate massive shifts to millet and other hardy grains. But when the very sun has abandoned you, even the most resilient crops struggle to photosynthesize effectively. It's like trying to run a solar panel under a dirty blanket. Technically possible, but practically useless. The famine doesn't arrive all at once like some dramatic movie scene. Instead, it creeps in gradually, each failed harvest tightening the noose a little more. First, the bread gets smaller and darker, mixed with sawdust, acorns, or whatever else can add bulk. Then it disappears entirely, replaced by thin gruel made from whatever grains remain. Soon you're eating things that would have disgusted you a year ago. Tree bark soup, leather boiled until it's theoretically digestible, grass seeds that leave your stomach cramped and bloated. In Ireland, there's archaeological evidence of people eating bog butter that had been buried for preservation decades earlier. So desperate they were digging up their grandparents' emergency supplies. The Byzantine Empire, arguably the most sophisticated administrative state of its time, watches helplessly as its complex food distribution system collapses. Emperor Justinian, who just a decade earlier was reconquering the Western Roman Empire and building the Hagia Sophia, now can't even guarantee bread for Constantinople. The imperial granaries, designed to withstand sieges and bad harvests, empty at an alarming rate. Officials implement increasingly draconian rationing systems, but you can't ration what doesn't exist. The price of grain increases by 300% in some markets, assuming you can find any grain at all. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine state's response was remarkably effective, given the circumstances, or woefully inadequate. But from your perspective as a starving citizen, such debates are purely academic. In Scandinavia, the situation is so dire that entire villages simply vanish from the archaeological record. Not destroyed, not abandoned gradually, they just stop, like someone hit the delete key on entire communities. Swedish researchers have found settlements where the last layer of habitation shows signs of extreme dietary stress. Bones of dogs, cats, and even rats in cooking pots, followed by nothing. The people either died or fled, leaving behind ghost towns that wouldn't be resettled for generations. One particularly haunting find from Norway included children's toys abandoned in homes, suggesting families left so quickly they couldn't even gather their most precious possessions. You develop a new relationship with hunger, learning its various stages like an unwanted education. First comes the gnawing emptiness, then the strange energy as your body starts consuming its reserves, followed by the lethargy as those reserves dwindle. Your skin becomes thin and papery, your hair falls out in clumps, and your teeth loosen in their sockets, classic signs of severe malnutrition that archaeologists find in skeletal remains from this period. Children develop the swollen bellies of kwashiorkor, while adults waste away to walking skeletons. The lucky ones die quickly, the unlucky ones linger for months in a twilight between life and death. What makes this famine particularly cruel is its universality. Usually, if crops fail in one region, you can trade for food from areas with better harvests. But when the entire northern hemisphere is suffering simultaneous agricultural collapse, there's nowhere to turn. The Silk Road, that great artery of international trade, becomes a highway of mutual desperation. Merchants who once carried silk and spices now search frantically for any edible cargo, finding only other starving people with nothing to trade but their own hunger. Just when you think things can't possibly get worse, you start noticing the strange lumps appearing on your neighbors' necks and groins. The swellings are the size of apples, black and weeping, and anyone who develops them is usually dead within days. Welcome to the Justinian Plague, nature's way of kicking humanity while it's already face down in the volcanic ash. This isn't just any plague, it's Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later star in the Black Death's European tour. But while the 14th century version hit a relatively well-fed population, this one arrives when everyone's immune system is already compromised by starvation and stress. You watch the disease spread with terrifying efficiency through your weakened community. The plague doesn't care about your social status, your prayers, or your attempts at quarantine. It moves through Constantinople at a rate that makes modern epidemiologists wince. At its peak, the Byzantine historian Procopius claims 10,000 people died daily in the capital alone, even if he's exaggerating by half. That's still an apocalyptic death rate. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, creating secondary health crises as corpses rot in the streets. The sweet, cloying smell of death becomes so pervasive that people stuff herbs in their nostrils just to function. Here's a particularly grim detail that archaeological evidence confirms. Mass burial sites from this period show clear signs of hasty, disorganized interment. In Britain, plague cemeteries contain bodies thrown in without ceremony, sometimes still wearing jewelry or carrying coins, grave goods that normally would have been looted, suggesting either extreme haste or that there simply weren't enough healthy people left to rob the dead. Some burial pits contain hundreds of bodies in layers, separated by thin coverings of lime in a futile attempt to control the stench and disease. Imagine being the person whose job it is to throw quicklime on your neighbor's corpses, knowing you'll probably join them soon. The plague symptoms are a masterclass in biological horror. First comes the fever and chills, then the characteristic buboes, those apple-sized swellings in the lymph nodes. But this isn't just bubonic plague. In malnourished populations, it often progresses to pneumonic plague, spreading through coughs and turning lungs into bloody sponges. Some victims develop septicemic plague, where the bacteria overwhelms the bloodstream so quickly that people can literally drop dead while walking. Byzantine medical texts describe victims vomiting blood and developing black blisters all over their bodies, what we now recognize as subcutaneous hemorrhaging from disseminated intravascular coagulation. Try explaining that to a 6th century physician who thinks disease is caused by bad air and unbalanced humors. You attempt various desperate remedies, each more useless than the last. Following the medical wisdom of your time, you might try bloodletting, removing blood from already weakened patients. Prayer, which at least provides psychological comfort, or exotic treatments like powdered emeralds or mercury compounds, which probably killed people faster than the plague. Some communities turn to mass religious processions, which have the unfortunate side effect of spreading the disease even faster. Others implement crude quarantines, marking infected houses with symbols and forbidding entry or exit. In Milan, officials simply brick up houses with sick people inside, condemning entire families to die together. Brutal, but marginally effective. The plague doesn't just kill, it destroys the very fabric of society. Traditional burial customs collapse when there are too many dead and too few living. In Christian communities where proper burial is essential for salvation, the inability to provide Christian funerals causes almost as much anguish as the deaths themselves. Family structures disintegrate as parents abandon infected children and spouses flee from each other. Procopius describes scenes of mothers who threw their dead children into the water and corpses scattered about unburied. The social contract that binds communities together dissolves in the acid of pure survival instinct. What's particularly fascinating, in a horrible way, is how the plague interacts with the ongoing famine. Modern epidemiologists studying historical pandemics note that malnutrition doesn't just weaken immune systems, it can actually alter disease progression. Protein deficiency affects antibody production, while vitamin deficiencies compromise cellular immunity. The result is that plague victims in 536 often presented with unusual symptoms or died from typically non-fatal secondary infections. Historians still debate whether the Justinian plague was actually more virulent than later plague outbreaks, or whether the population was just so weakened that even a normal plague became catastrophically lethal. The demographic impact defies easy comprehension. Some regions lose 25% of their population. Others, particularly urban centers and trade routes, might lose half or more. Entire professions disappear as specialized craftsmen die without passing on their knowledge. The Roman Empire's tax records from this period show village after village marked as deserted or unable to pay due to mortality. In Constantinople, Justinian himself contracts the plague but survives, one of history's lucky breaks, though his empire would never fully recover from the combined hammer blows of volcanic winter and pandemic. You're living through what historians would later recognize as one of the great demographic catastrophes of human history, a population collapse that would take centuries to fully recover from. You watch as the elaborate machinery of civilization grinds to a halt, its gears clogged with ash, blood, and desperation. The Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, though nobody calls it that in your time, begins fragmenting like a ceramic pot dropped from a great height. Emperor Justinian, who just years ago was dreaming of restoring Rome's ancient glory, now can barely hold Constantinople together. His ambitious reconquest of Italy and North Africa becomes a bitter joke as he struggles to feed his remaining soldiers, who are increasingly asking why they should die for an empire that can't even guarantee them bread. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty collapses entirely, splitting into Eastern and Western Wei in 534, just in time for the catastrophe. The timing couldn't be worse. A freshly divided empire trying to handle simultaneous famine and plague. Chinese records describe armies simply melting away as soldiers desert to find food for their families or die from disease in their camps. One chronicle mentions a general arriving at a fortress with 10,000 men and leaving 2 months later with fewer than 1,000, the rest claimed by starvation and sickness. Military campaigns are abandoned mid-siege because there's nothing left to feed the besiegers, leading to the surreal spectacle of armies retreating from victories they can't afford to win. The Sassanid Persian Empire fares no better, despite being one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world. The complex Qanat irrigation systems that made Persian agriculture possible begin failing as communities lack the manpower to maintain them. These underground water channels require constant cleaning and repair. Skip a season, and they clog with silt. Skip 2 seasons because everyone's dead or fled, and they collapse entirely. Archaeologists have found entire regions in Iran where settlement patterns show continuous habitation for over 1,000 years, then sudden abandonment around 540 CE. The empire that had fought Rome to a standstill for centuries finds itself fighting a losing battle against hunger and disease. Here's where things get properly weird. In Britain, this period marks the beginning of what historians call the Anglo-Saxon Adventus, essentially. The native Romano-British population is so weakened that Germanic peoples can migrate in and take over with minimal resistance. It's not the violent invasion of popular imagination, but more like moving into a house where most of the previous tenants have died. Archaeological evidence shows Germanic cultural artifacts suddenly appearing in areas that had been Romano-British for centuries, often with no signs of warfare. The survivors simply lacked the numbers or organization to resist. One day, you're living in post-Roman Britain. The next, you're learning Anglo-Saxon, because all your Latin-speaking neighbors are dead. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan experiences what archaeologists delicately call societal stress indicators, evidence of malnutrition, population decline, and abandonment of outlying areas. While the city wouldn't fall completely until the late 600s, the seeds of collapse are being planted now. The Maya city-states fare even worse. Tree ring data from Central America shows the same signature of volcanic cooling, and Maya inscriptions from this period become notably sparse. Some cities simply stop erecting dated monuments, what researchers call the Maya hiatus. It's as if entire civilizations hit the pause button, too busy dying to maintain their calendars. The Gupta Empire in India, often called the Golden Age of classical Indian culture, enters terminal decline. The empire that produced groundbreaking advances in mathematics, astronomy, and literature can't produce enough food to feed its scholars. Universities empty as students and teachers scatter in search of sustenance. The great library at Nalanda survives, but barely, its monks recording dramatic decreases in new students and visiting scholars. One inscription mentions that the halls of learning echo with silence where once they rang with debate, a poetic way of saying everyone's too hungry to think about philosophy. Political authority becomes meaningless when you can't perform the basic function of keeping your subjects alive. Tax collection collapses, you can't tax dead people, and the living have nothing left to give. Legal systems break down as courts cease to function, and judges flee or die. The concept of property rights becomes almost quaint when possession is determined by who's still alive to claim something. In some regions, historians note the complete abandonment of coinage, with communities reverting to pure barter systems. Money only works when people believe it has value and there's something to buy. When bread costs more than gold and gold can't buy bread anyway, the entire monetary system becomes an absurd fiction. You're witnessing what political scientists would later term cascading state failure, when multiple critical systems fail simultaneously, each failure amplifying the others. It's like watching dominoes fall. If each domino was the size of a civilization and took thousands of people with it when it toppled, the sophisticated administrative structures that took centuries to build disappear in a matter of years. Regional governors declare independence not from ambition, but from necessity. When the capital can't send food, funds, or instructions, local strongmen fill the vacuum. The result is political fragmentation that would define the next several centuries of human history. As the great empires of antiquity shatter into the feudal patchwork of the Middle Ages, modern science has finally given you, or rather, your distant descendants, the tools to prove that 536 CE wasn't just a bad year, but literally the worst year in the last 2 millennia. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica serve as frozen time capsules, each layer preserving the atmospheric chemistry of its year like nature's own filing system. When scientists analyze the layer from 536, they find volcanic sulfates at concentrations that make them double-check their equipment. We're talking about 100 times the normal background level, the atmospheric equivalent of someone screaming in a library. Tree rings tell an equally grim story. Dendrochronologists studying ancient trees from Siberia to California find that 536 shows the narrowest growth rings in over 2,000 years of data. Some trees, particularly those at higher elevations or northern latitudes, show no growth at all, just a dark line where a ring should be, like nature's redacted document. In the Altai Mountains, researchers found larch trees that were 500 years old, silent witnesses to centuries of history. And even these ancient survivors showed more stress in 536 than during any other period of their impossibly long lives. One particularly telling specimen from Sweden shows normal growth until 536, then practically flatlines for a decade before slowly recovering. Here's a detail that sends chills down climatologists' spines. The temperature reconstruction from multiple proxies, ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and cave deposits all point to a cooling of 2.5 to 3 degrees in summer temperatures across the northern hemisphere. That might not sound catastrophic until you realize it's a bigger temperature swing than the entire Little Ice Age, compressed into a single year. It's the climatological equivalent of falling off a cliff rather than walking down a slope. The data is so extreme that when researchers first analyzed it, they assumed there must be contamination or measurement error. Nope, the world really did get that cold, that fast. The chemical signature in those ice cores reveals something even more specific. The volcanic ash contains unusually high levels of bismuth and sulfur, suggesting a violent, explosive eruption that punched through Earth's crust with tremendous force. This wasn't a gentle Hawaiian-style lava flow, but what volcanologists call a Plinian or ultra-Plinian eruption, the kind where the volcanic column reaches the stratosphere and stays there. Scientists can even detect microscopic tephra, volcanic glass, in ice cores from both poles, meaning this eruption was so powerful it distributed material globally within weeks. Marine sediment cores add another piece to the puzzle. Foraminifera, tiny marine organisms whose shells preserve ocean chemistry, show dramatic changes in their isotope ratios around 536. The oceans cooled significantly, disrupting currents and marine ecosystems. It's like finding a crime scene where even the witnesses at the bottom of the ocean can testify to the global catastrophe. These tiny shells, no bigger than sand grains, carry chemical proof of worldwide environmental collapse that corroborates every other piece of evidence. What really clinches the worst year ever title is the convergence of multiple independent datasets. Chinese astronomers recording dim suns, Irish monks noting summer frost, Byzantine historians describing famine, Maya scribes going silent. All of these scattered historical accounts suddenly make sense when viewed through the lens of scientific data. It's not just that one region had a bad time. It's that every human civilization capable of keeping records documented the same catastrophe. Historians still debate whether the Maya knew about the Byzantine Empire or if Chinese scholars ever heard of Irish monasteries. But the volcanic winter of 536 created a shared global experience of misery that transcended all cultural boundaries. The scientific tools keep getting better, revealing new horrors. Laser ablation analysis of ice cores can now detect volcanic events with monthly resolution, showing that the 536 eruption was likely followed by multiple smaller eruptions that refreshed the aerosol veil just as it began to clear. Sulfur isotope analysis suggests the eruption occurred at high latitude, probably Iceland or Alaska, which explains why the cooling was so severe in the northern hemisphere. Each new analytical technique adds another brushstroke to the portrait of catastrophe. Perhaps most remarkably, scientists can now model the eruption's effects using climate simulations. When they input the volcanic forcing derived from ice core data into state-of-the-art climate models, the results match historical accounts with eerie precision. The models predict exactly the kind of prolonged cooling, disrupted precipitation patterns, and agricultural collapse described in ancient texts. It's like having a time machine that can only show you the worst parts of history. These simulations suggest that full climate recovery took at least a decade, with some regions experiencing disrupted weather patterns for a generation. The models also show something historians suspected but couldn't prove. The volcanic winter created feedback loops where initial cooling led to expanded snow cover, which reflected more sunlight, causing further cooling, a frozen hellscape that perpetuated itself. You wake before dawn. Not that you can tell anymore, since dawn and noon look basically identical in this perpetual twilight. Your stomach cramps from hunger, a constant companion now that feels like someone's twisting your intestines into knots. First task: check if anyone in your household died during the night. It's become such a routine that you've developed a morbid efficiency, quickly checking for breathing before moving on to the endless struggle of finding something, anything, to eat. Your morning meal consists of a thin gruel made from ground acorns mixed with sawdust. Yes, actual sawdust, because it adds bulk and tricks your stomach into thinking it's full for about an hour. You've learned to grind it extremely fine. Otherwise, the splinters tear up your insides worse than the hunger. Some of your neighbors have started adding clay to their bread, having heard it helps with the constant diarrhea. It doesn't, but desperation makes philosophers of us all. The children have stopped crying for food. That stage passed weeks ago. Now they just stare with those hollow eyes that will haunt whatever future generations survive this. Water collection has become a twice-daily ritual of paramount importance. The volcanic ash has contaminated most surface water sources, giving everything a sulfurous taste that makes you gag. You've learned to filter it through sand and charcoal. A technique passed down from someone who heard it from someone who claimed it helped. Does it work? Who knows? But the ritual provides some illusion of control. You boil everything: water, snow, even the morning dew you painstakingly collect from the few surviving plants. Dysentery is almost as effective a killer as the plague. And you've seen too many neighbors shit themselves to death to take chances. You venture out to forage, joining the daily parade of skeletal figures combing through the same picked-over territory. Everyone knows the good spots have been exhausted months ago, but you go through the motions anyway. Tree bark from certain species can be boiled into a bitter but theoretically nutritious soup. Pine needles make a tea that prevents scurvy. Knowledge that would have seemed useless in the time of plenty, but now represents the difference between keeping your teeth and watching them fall out. You've become an expert in desperation botany, which roots won't poison you immediately, which mushrooms will kill you versus just making you wish they had, how to process acorns to remove enough tannins that they won't destroy your kidneys. The social dynamics of your community have warped beyond recognition. That cheerful baker who used to slip extra rolls to children. He was caught hoarding grain and beaten to death by a mob. The pious priest who preached charity. He fled with the church's gold weeks ago. Trust has become a luxury more expensive than food. You've learned to eat in secret, to never discuss any successful foraging, to lie about your family's condition. When your neighbor's child disappears and the family suddenly has meat in their pot, you don't ask questions. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry. Work, in any traditional sense, has ceased to exist. The blacksmith's forge stands cold. No fuel to burn and no customers who can pay. The market square that once bustled with commerce now hosts only the desperate trading whatever possessions remain for handfuls of grain. You witness bizarre exchanges, a gold necklace for a half-rotten turnip, a beautifully crafted sword for a bag of mouldy flour. The concept of value has been fundamentally rewritten. Skills that mattered a year ago, writing, metalworking, artistic talent, are now worthless compared to knowing how to trap rats or identify edible weeds. Personal hygiene has become a forgotten luxury. Soap requires fat, and fat gets eaten. You haven't properly bathed in months, just occasional splashes with that sulfur-tainted water when the smell becomes unbearable even by current standards. Lice are universal. Fleas a constant companion. You've stopped bothering to pick them off, they'll just return. And the effort burns calories you can't spare. Everyone walks in a cloud of their own stench. Unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, infected wounds that won't heal on malnourished flesh. The volcanic ash gets into everything, grinding between your teeth, irritating your eyes, turning your skin into a gritty landscape of sores and rashes. Disease prevention consists mainly of avoiding the obviously sick, though in a population where everyone looks half dead, that's increasingly difficult. You've developed a sixth sense for plague victims, the way they move, the fever, bright eyes, the subtle smell of impending death. When someone collapses in the street, nobody helps. You step around them, averting your eyes, muttering prayers or curses depending on your remaining faith. Compassion is another luxury you can't afford. You tell yourself you'll be a good person again when the sun returns, if it ever does, if you live that long. For now, survival has stripped you down to your most basic, selfish core, and you hate yourself for it, but not enough to change. The gold coins in your hand are worthless, pretty metal discs that can't fill a stomach or warm a body. You watch as the entire economic system, built over centuries of careful development, collapses faster than Rome fell. Markets that once traded goods from 3 continents now sit empty, their stalls abandoned or torn apart for firewood. The Silk Road, that great artery of civilization connecting East and West, has become a path of mutual starvation, where desperate merchants find only other desperate merchants with nothing to trade but tales of misery. Currency becomes a sick joke when there's nothing to buy. In Constantinople, the solidus, the gold standard that had maintained its value for over 200 years, suddenly can't purchase a loaf of bread because there are no loaves to purchase. The imperial mints keep striking coins out of habit or delusion, but you might as well be minting snowflakes for all the good they do. Some communities try to maintain price controls, declaring that bread must cost no more than X coins, but you can't regulate what doesn't exist. The invisible hand of the market has become a skeletal fist, crushing rather than guiding. Barter returns with a vengeance, but it's a twisted version of prehistoric trade. You're not exchanging specialized goods for mutual benefit. You're trading whatever you haven't eaten yet for whatever someone else hasn't eaten yet. An iron pot for a handful of barley, a wool cloak for a dead rat, your grandmother's jewelry for information about where to find edible roots. The complexity of 6th century commerce, with its letters of credit, international exchange rates, and sophisticated contracts, evaporates like morning dew in hell. Historians still argue whether this represents economic regression or adaptation, but from your perspective, it's simply what happens when money becomes inedible paper and metal. The collapse of specialized production creates cascading failures throughout society. That pottery workshop that employed dozens and supplied half the region closed when the workers starved and the customers vanished. The textile mill that wove cloth for export. The looms stand silent because the sheep are dead, and the weavers are either dead or searching for food. Every broken link in the supply chain breaks 10 more. You can't make bread without mills to grind grain, but you can't maintain mills without millwrights. And you can't feed millwrights when there's no grain to grind. It's economic death by 1,000 cuts, each one bleeding out more of civilization's lifeblood. Here's a particularly perverse detail. In some regions, slavery paradoxically increases even as the economy collapses. Not the organized slave trade of earlier eras, but desperate people selling themselves or their children for the promise of food. Roman law had complex regulations about voluntary servitude, but law means nothing when the alternative is starvation. Parents face the impossible choice of watching their children die free or live enslaved. Some slaveholders, finding they can't feed their existing slaves, simply release them to die on their own, a twisted mercy that solves the owner's problem while condemning the freed to almost certain death. International trade, already disrupted by plague and warfare, grinds to a complete halt. Ships sit rotting in harbours because there's no cargo worth carrying and no crew healthy enough to sail. The great warehouses of Alexandria, once filled with grain for export, stand empty as Egypt hoards what little it can produce. Indian spices, Chinese silk, Baltic amber, all the luxury goods that once defined civilized life become mythical memories. Even if you could afford them, they simply don't exist in any accessible market. The trade networks that took centuries to build unravel in months. Financial records from this period, where they exist, read like suicide notes from entire economies. Byzantine tax rolls show village after village contributing nothing, marked with ominous notations: abandoned, all dead, no survivors found. Chinese provincial reports describe tax collection attempts that yield only handfuls of grain from regions that once fed millions. The sophisticated credit systems that enabled long-distance trade collapse when neither creditor nor debtor survives to honor contracts. Debts become meaningless when the lender is dead and the borrower is dying. What replaces the money economy is something anthropologists would recognize from the earliest human societies, but with none of the social cohesion that made those systems work. It's not gift economy or reciprocal altruism. It's desperate scrambling where trust extends no further than your immediate family, and sometimes not even that far. Every transaction is immediate, physical, and final. No credit, no promises, no future obligations because nobody believes in a future anymore. You trade what you have now for what you need now, and tomorrow can go fuck itself because tomorrow you might be dead. The entire concept of investment, putting resources into something that will pay off later, becomes absurd when later seems like a fairy tale. Why plant crops when the sun might never return? Why repair your house when you'll probably die before winter? Why save anything when tomorrow's meal is purely theoretical? The abandoned temples fill with desperate worshippers trying to bargain with any deity who might be listening. In Constantinople, Christians pack into the Hagia Sophia, that magnificent architectural wonder completed just before the catastrophe, their prayers echoing off golden mosaics depicting a heaven that seems to have abandoned earth. The priests struggle to explain why God has turned the sun black and sent plague to kill the faithful alongside the sinners. Some claim it's punishment for Justinian's theological policies. Others blame heretics, Jews, pagans. Anyone different becomes a target for divine wrath that needs a human face. You watch as apocalyptic cults spring up like mushrooms after rain. Except these mushrooms feed on despair instead of decay. Self-proclaimed prophets wander the streets, their eyes bright with malnutrition and madness, declaring exact dates for the world's end. When those dates pass and the world stubbornly continues its miserable existence, they simply calculate new ones. One particularly creative doom preacher in Rome claims the volcanic darkness is actually smoke from the opening of hell's gates. He gains quite a following until he dies of plague, which his disciples interpret as divine translation rather than bacterial infection. The pagan holdouts experienced their own crisis of faith. In Scandinavia, offerings to the old gods increased dramatically. Archaeological sites from this period are littered with deliberately broken weapons, sacrificed animals, and occasionally worse things. The gods of harvest and sun have clearly abandoned their duties, so desperate communities try increasingly extreme measures to regain divine favor. Runic inscriptions from this era often contain pleas for the return of light or curses against whoever caused the darkness. One stone from Denmark simply reads, "The sun died, we died, the gods died." Cheerful stuff that really captures the mood. Here's where human psychology gets properly weird. Mass religious movements emerge that embrace the catastrophe rather than seeking to end it. Flagellant groups appear centuries before their more famous medieval counterparts, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. Some Christian sects declare that suffering is the path to salvation, that God is testing the faithful through extreme hardship. They actively seek out plague victims to nurse, not from compassion, but from a desire to suffer and die in holy agony. It's spiritual suicide dressed up as devotion, and it spreads almost as fast as the actual plague. Syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, accelerates dramatically as people hedge their spiritual bets. Christians start incorporating pagan protection symbols into their prayers, while pagans adopt Christian saints as new additions to their pantheons. In Britain, you find Christian crosses carved with runic inscriptions, and pagan temples repurposed as churches still containing active shrines to older gods. Nobody's taking chances when the world is ending. You might attend Mass in the morning, sacrifice to Woden at noon, and consult a Persian astrologer in the evening. Theological purity becomes a luxury, as unaffordable as clean water. Religious authorities struggle to maintain any semblance of orthodox control. The careful theological debates that occupy church councils seem absurdly academic when congregations are more interested in whether God has abandoned them entirely. Priests who insist on traditional liturgy find empty churches, while charismatic healers and doom prophets draw crowds. The official church tries to suppress these movements, but it's hard to enforce religious law when your bishops are dying of plague and your enforcement agents are busy searching for food. Miracles, real or imagined, become the only currency that matters in the spiritual economy. Every survival story transforms into divine intervention. Every unexpected food source becomes manna from heaven. A merchant claims the Virgin Mary led him to a hidden grain store. Never mind that he probably hid it himself months earlier. A child recovers from plague, and suddenly their house becomes a pilgrimage site. These stories spread faster than disease, mutating with each telling until the original event becomes unrecognizable. Hope, even false hope, is a commodity more precious than gold. The real tragedy is how the crisis poisons faith itself. The comfortable certainties of organized religion, that good behavior brings reward, that God protects the innocent, that suffering has meaning, crumble in the face of indiscriminate death. You see pious families starve while criminals prosper through hoarding. Children die in agony while their parents' prayers go unanswered. The theological explanations offered by priests sound increasingly hollow. It's God's will. It's a test. It's punishment for sins you didn't know you committed. Some people cling harder to faith as the only constant in a world gone mad. Others abandon it entirely, deciding that any God who would permit this isn't worth worshipping. Most just go through the motions, performing rituals from habit rather than belief, praying to gods they're no longer sure exist for mercies they no longer expect to receive. The natural world around you has gone completely insane, as if nature itself has forgotten how to function properly. Birds fall from the sky mid-flight, their internal navigation systems scrambled by the perpetual twilight. Migratory patterns that have existed since before humans could write are suddenly broken. Geese flying in circles, swallows arriving months late or not at all. You find their tiny corpses scattered across the frozen ground, victims of a world where summer never came and their food sources vanished. Even the sparrows, those indestructible urban survivors, struggle to find seeds in a landscape where plants refuse to bloom. Trees exhibit behavior that would fascinate botanists if any were left alive to study them. Deciduous trees shed their leaves in what should be midsummer, confused by the temperature and light signals. Then, in a desperate attempt to photosynthesize, some sprout new leaves in autumn, only to have them immediately killed by frost. The result is forests full of skeletal trees covered in black, rotting foliage, a sight that convinces many that the very earth is dying. Fruit trees bloom erratically or not at all. Apple orchards that have produced for generations stand barren, their confused biology unable to cope with 18 months of winter. Domesticated animals fare even worse than wild ones. Cattle, already weakened by lack of fodder, develop strange behaviors, walking in endless circles, attacking their handlers, or simply lying down and refusing to move until they die. Horses gnaw bark from trees until their mouths bleed, driven by hunger to eat things that destroy their digestive systems. Chickens stop laying eggs entirely, their biological clocks so disrupted they forget how to be chickens. Pigs, those clever survivors, turn increasingly aggressive, forming feral packs that attack humans. Some communities report pigs developing a taste for human flesh after scavenging plague victims, a detail that makes everyone eye their former livestock with new suspicion. Here's a deeply unsettling phenomenon: mass animal die-offs that follow no known pattern. Entire flocks of sheep found dead with no visible injuries. Whole rookeries of crows scattered lifeless beneath their roosts. Medieval chroniclers describe fish floating belly up in rivers and lakes, their bodies showing no signs of disease or poisoning. Modern scientists studying sediment cores from this period find evidence of massive aquatic ecosystem collapse. Layers of organic matter suggesting whole food chains died and sank to the bottom simultaneously. It's as if the volcanic winter triggered some kind of biological systems failure that cascaded through entire ecosystems. Insect populations explode in some areas while vanishing entirely in others. Regions that rarely saw locusts suddenly face biblical swarms that devour what little vegetation survives. But these aren't healthy locusts, they're desperate, malnourished insects engaging in cannibalistic feeding frenzies, eating each other as much as crops. Meanwhile, beneficial insects like bees simply disappear, whole hives found empty, as if the bees collectively decided existence wasn't worth the effort. Without pollinators, even plants that survive the cold can't reproduce, creating cascading agricultural failures that will persist for years. The seasonal rhythms that have governed life since the last ice age are completely broken. Spring arrives late or not at all. Summer feels like autumn, autumn like winter, and winter like something from Norse mythology, endless, bitter, and hostile to all life. The few farmers still trying to maintain agricultural calendars report complete chaos. Seeds that should sprout in weeks take months or never germinate at all. Growing seasons compressed to mere weeks between killing frosts. Harvests that should ripen in sequence all failing simultaneously. It's agricultural anarchy, and traditional knowledge passed down through generations becomes useless. Predator-prey relationships collapse into chaos as starving carnivores turn to unusual food sources. Wolves, normally wary of human settlements, prowl city streets in broad daylight, what passes for daylight anyway. Bears, unable to find enough food to hibernate properly, emerge from dens midwinter, confused and dangerously aggressive. Pack dynamics break down as social animals turn on each other. One Byzantine account describes watching a wolf pack cannibalize its own wounded members in the city forum, a scene that would have been unthinkable in normal times, but now seems almost mundane in its horror. Perhaps most disturbing are the subtle changes in familiar species. Dogs, humanity's oldest companions, begin reverting to feral behaviors within a single generation. Those pampered hunting hounds and loyal guard dogs form wild packs when their owners die or can no longer feed them. They interbreed with wolves, creating aggressive hybrids that show no fear of humans. Cats, always semi-wild, abandon human settlements entirely, their offspring growing up without any socialization. Within just a few years, domestication patterns that took millennia to establish begin unraveling. The animals seem to understand something humans are slower to grasp. The old world is ending, and survival means abandoning 10,000 years of mutual dependence. Nature isn't just struggling. It's fundamentally reorganizing itself around a new, harsher reality. You watch the last literate person in your village die, taking with them the ability to read the few precious manuscripts your community once treasured. The books themselves have long since been burned for warmth or boiled in desperate attempts to extract nutrition from their leather bindings. An entire library, accumulated over generations, reduced to ash in a single bitter winter night when the choice was freeze or burn the past. Those beautifully illuminated texts, once copied by monks who spent years on single pages, last about 10 minutes as fuel. Knowledge literally goes up in smoke. The infrastructure of learning collapses like a house of termite-eaten wood. Schools empty as teachers die or flee, and parents can't spare children from the desperate work of survival. Why learn to read when there's nothing to read? Why study mathematics when the only calculation that matters is how many days of food remain? The University of Constantinople, pride of the Eastern Roman Empire, maintains a skeleton staff of scholars who debate theology while gnawing on leather shoe straps. One chronicler mentions attending a lecture where the professor collapsed mid-sentence from hunger, his students too weak to help him. Academic discourse continues right up until it doesn't. Practical knowledge vanishes even faster than theoretical learning. The master blacksmith dies before passing on the secret of Damascus steel. The engineer who maintains the aqueducts succumbs to plague, taking with him decades of accumulated wisdom about water flow and pressure. Complex crafts that require years of apprenticeship, glassblowing, fine metalwork, architectural mathematics, disappear in a single generation. You can't maintain apprenticeship systems when masters and students alike are focused on finding their next meal. The elaborate guild structures that preserved and transmitted technical knowledge dissolve as surely as sugar in rain. Here's a particularly tragic detail. Archaeological evidence suggests many communities attempted to preserve knowledge even as they died. Buried hoards of manuscripts wrapped in oiled cloth, technical drawings carved into stone, metal plates inscribed with what appeared to be instruction manuals, desperate attempts to throw bottles into the ocean of time, but without living masters to interpret them. These artifacts become as indecipherable as linear A. A blueprint for an advanced watermill is useless if nobody remembers what the symbols mean or has the tools to build it? Medical knowledge regresses at breathtaking speed. The sophisticated diagnostic techniques of Byzantine physicians, based on centuries of Greek and Roman medical tradition, give way to pure superstition. When trained doctors die faster than anyone else, constant exposure to plague victims will do that. They're replaced by whoever claims to have healing powers. Surgical procedures that were routine in 530 CE become lost arts by 540. One medical text from the period shows clear evidence of multiple authors, beginning with precise anatomical descriptions and devolving into recommendations for prayer and pigeon blood. It's like watching civilization lobotomize itself. The oral traditions that might preserve knowledge in non-literate societies fare no better. The storytellers, bards, and memory keepers who maintain cultural continuity need audiences, leisure time, and most importantly, successors. But children who should be learning ancestral stories are dying or too malnourished for complex memory tasks. Genealogies that stretch back centuries end abruptly. Epic poems transmitted for generations fall silent mid-verse. The elaborate memory palace techniques used by Celtic druids and Germanic skalds require years of training and well-fed brains. Starving minds can't maintain the neural architecture needed for such feats. Languages themselves begin to shift and simplify. The complex grammatical structures of classical Latin start their slide toward the simplified Romance languages, not through natural evolution, but through catastrophic disruption. When half your speakers die and the survivors include many non-native speakers, linguistic complexity becomes unsustainable. Regional dialects that might have taken centuries to diverge split apart in decades. Children grow up hearing multiple languages as refugees flee across linguistic boundaries, creating Creole tongues that their grandparents wouldn't recognize. The Tower of Babel, collapsing in real time. Writing materials become impossibly precious. Parchment requires animal skins, but the animals are eaten, skin and all. Papyrus imports from Egypt cease when Egypt has no surplus of anything. People resort to writing on bark, carved into wood, scratched onto pottery shards. But why write when nobody can read? Why record events when the only event is death? Some monasteries maintain chronicle traditions through sheer stubborn faith, producing entries like, "The sun remained dark, many died, God have mercy." Not exactly detailed historical records. The very concept of progress dies during these dark years. For the first time in centuries, each generation knows less than the one before. Children grow up in a world objectively worse than their parents knew, with fewer capabilities, less knowledge, reduced possibilities. The assumption that tomorrow will be better than today, fundamental to human motivation, inverts into certainty that tomorrow will be worse. Why build when destruction is inevitable? Why learn when knowledge can't save you? Why plan when the future extends no further than the next meal? It's not just technological regression, but psychological devolution. Humanity forgetting how to hope. Historians still argue whether the Dark Ages were really that dark, but from where you're standing, watching the last literate person in your community die without passing on their knowledge, the darkness seems pretty fucking literal. Law and order don't collapse. They're simply abandoned. Like a game everyone agrees to stop playing when the stakes become survival. The magistrate who once dispensed justice with pompous certainty. He was seen last week gnawing on tree bark in the forest. The guards who enforced his verdicts. They formed a bandit gang that raids the very communities they once protected. The elaborate legal codes that govern Byzantine society, those hundreds of years of accumulated precedent and procedure, become less relevant than the simple rule: take what you can, defend what you must, trust no one. You witness the complete inversion of social hierarchies that seemed divinely ordained just years ago. The local aristocrat who owned vast estates now begs for scraps at the door of his former stable hand, the one who knew how to trap rats and identify edible plants. Practical survival skills trump inherited privilege so thoroughly that noble bloodlines become liability rather than asset. Those soft hands that never worked, they can't dig roots. That refined palate, it can't stomach the things that keep you alive now. You watch former senators prostitute their daughters for moldy bread, while clever peasants who hoarded grain early become the new power brokers. Murder becomes so common it's barely worth mentioning. Not passionate crimes or calculated assassination, just the casual killing that comes from desperate competition over resources. You find a body in the street, check for anything useful, and move on. The concept of investigation, of justice, of consequences, all luxuries from a time when society had surplus energy for such concerns. A man kills his neighbor for a handful of barley. The neighbor's family kills him in return. His family retaliates. Blood feuds that would have been settled by law courts spiral into generational vendettas that will persist for centuries. Here's a detail that really drives home the complete social breakdown: cannibalism. Not the ritualistic endo-cannibalism of certain cultures, but desperate survival cannibalism that starts with the already dead and progresses to darker places. Byzantine chronicles mention it obliquely: unspeakable acts and violations of divine law. But archaeological evidence is less coy. Human bones found in cooking pots, cut marks indicating butchering, demographic profiles showing unusual patterns of missing individuals. It starts with enemies, progresses to strangers, and eventually, well, children start disappearing. And nobody asks questions when certain families seem better fed than others. Slavery explodes, but in forms that would have horrified classical slave owners. This isn't the regulated institution of Roman law with its complex rights and protections, but raw human ownership based solely on force. Captured enemies, debtors, even voluntary slaves who trade freedom for food, all become property in the most brutal sense. But here's the cosmic joke. Slaves and masters often die at equal rates because you can't eat ownership. Some slaveholders, finding they can't feed their human property, simply abandon them en masse. Others work them to death, extracting whatever food remains. The lucky slaves are those whose masters die first, freeing them to starve as free individuals rather than property, family structures. The basic unit of human society since we came down from the trees. Warp beyond recognition. Parents abandon children they can't feed. Children abandon elderly parents who've become burdens. Infanticide, particularly of females who represent future mouths that can't perform heavy labor, becomes so common that demographic records show skewed gender ratios for generations. The extended family networks that provided social security dissolve when cousin means competitor and brother means potential threat. Marriage becomes a purely economic transaction, not about dowries or alliances, but about who has food today. Religious and secular authorities attempt to maintain some semblance of order, issuing increasingly desperate and ignored proclamations. The emperor declares hoarding a capital crime, but the soldiers who should enforce it are themselves hoarding. The church preaches against cannibalism, but priests are found with suspicious meat in their cellars. Local strongmen emerge who rule through pure force, unencumbered by law or tradition. They last until someone stronger or hungrier comes along. It's not even warlordism. That implies some organizational structure. It's more like weaponized anarchy with temporary local winners. The very concept of property becomes fluid when possession depends entirely on force. That farm your family worked for generations, it belongs to whoever can defend it. Those gold coins you buried, they're worthless metal unless you can protect them. Documents proving ownership, contracts, deeds, all become kindling or toilet paper. A new form of law emerges based on immediate violence and temporary alliance. You own what you can hold. You rule what you can terrorize. You survive by becoming someone your former self would have feared. Communities that took centuries to build civilized structures revert to primate dominance hierarchies in months. The social contract hasn't been broken. It's been eaten, digested, and shat out as something unrecognizable. What emerges from this chaos won't be the classical world reformed, but something entirely new, the feudal system, born from the ashes of absolute social collapse. The roads clog with rivers of humanity fleeing nowhere in particular, just away from wherever they are now. You join these desperate migrations because movement feels like action, even when every destination proves as hellish as the origin. Entire populations uproot themselves based on rumors. There's food in the south. The plague hasn't reached the north. Some valley escaped the darkness. These rumors are always false. But hope makes people stupid, and desperate hope makes them mobile. The Roman roads that once carried legions and merchants now bear an endless procession of skeletal refugees, dragging whatever they couldn't bear to abandon. From China comes an exodus that dwarfs anything in recorded history. The Wei dynasty records speak of 10 million displaced souls fleeing south from the frozen northern provinces, even accounting for bureaucratic exaggeration. We're talking about population movements that reshape the ethnic map of Asia. Entire peoples who had lived in the same regions since before written history suddenly vanish, replaced by strangers speaking unfamiliar dialects, the Xiongnu, those eternal enemies of China, fragment and scatter so thoroughly that historians still debate where they ended up. Some say they became the Huns who would later terrorize Europe. Others argue they simply ceased to exist as a coherent people. In Europe, Germanic tribes that had pressed against Roman borders for centuries suddenly find those borders undefended, not because Rome has fallen. It's still technically there, but because the border guards are dead or have abandoned their posts to search for food. You watch as entire tribes cross the Rhine and Danube, not as invading armies, but as desperate refugees. The Angles and Saxons don't conquer Britain so much as walk into an emptying house. Archaeological evidence shows remarkably little warfare during these migrations. Hard to fight when everyone's starving. The native populations often simply vanish, died, fled, or absorbed into the incoming groups. Here's a particularly grim detail. Ship manifests and port records from the Mediterranean show the human trafficking that accompanies these migrations. Desperate people sell themselves to ship captains for passage to anywhere else. Ships designed for 100 passengers carry 500, packed like cordwood into holds. When storms hit, and in this volcanic winter, storms are frequent and vicious, entire ships go down with no survivors. The Mediterranean becomes a graveyard. Bodies wash up on shores for years afterward, so many that some beaches are renamed for the bones. One Byzantine record mentions a ship arriving in Alexandria with only 30 survivors from 400 who embarked. The rest died during the voyage, their bodies thrown overboard to make room for the living. The demographic upheaval creates ethnic conflicts that will echo for centuries. When starving locals meet starving refugees, the results are predictably horrific. Languages become battle lines. Religions become excuses for violence. Skin color, clothing style, accent. Any difference becomes justification for murder when resources are scarce. Communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations suddenly turn on each other. The careful ethnic balances maintained by imperial administration shatter when there's no administration left. In some regions, archaeological evidence shows complete population replacement. One material culture simply ends, replaced by entirely different pottery styles, burial practices, and building techniques. Climate refugees create cascading displacement effects. Northern peoples flee south into lands already struggling, displacing those populations further south, who displace others in turn. It's human dominoes on a continental scale. The Slavs, previously confined to small areas of Eastern Europe, suddenly expand across vast territories as other populations die or flee. The Bulgars ride out of the Asian steppes into European lands depopulated by plague and famine. The Berbers push into formerly Roman territories in North Africa. Every movement triggers three more, creating ethnic churning that fundamentally rewrites the human geography of Eurasia. Disease travels with these migrations, turning refugee columns into plague vectors. A group flees an infected area only to carry the infection with them, spreading it to previously untouched regions. Quarantine is impossible when the quarantined are mobile and desperate. Some communities attempt to block refugees, creating armed standoffs at bridges and mountain passes. The lucky refugees are merely turned away. The unlucky are killed and their bodies burned to prevent infection. One Frankish chronicle describes a bridge where refugee bodies were piled so high they dammed the river, creating a lake of corpses that poisoned downstream water supplies for years. Traditional hospitality customs, those ancient rules about treating strangers kindly, collapse under the sheer weight of numbers. How can you feed travelers when you can't feed your own children? How can you shelter strangers when sheltering them might mean death for your family? The social codes that made long-distance travel possible in the ancient world disappear, replaced by universal suspicion and hostility. Every stranger becomes a potential threat, carrier of disease, competitor for resources, possible cannibal. The migrations continue, not because anywhere is better, but because staying still means certain death, while movement offers at least the illusion of hope. You become part of this human flood, carrying your few possessions and many diseases toward horizons that offer nothing but different flavors of doom. Around 550 CE, you notice something that makes you weep with relief. The sun looks almost normal for the first time in over a decade. The oppressive volcanic fog that turned day into twilight finally begins to dissipate, revealing a sky you'd almost forgotten existed. But don't celebrate too quickly. This isn't recovery. It's just the beginning of the aftermath. The world that emerges from the darkness is fundamentally broken, like a bone that healed wrong and will never quite work the same way again. The demographic catastrophe becomes clear as communities attempt to rebuild. Entire regions stand empty, their cities crumbling and fields returning to wilderness. In Britain, archaeological evidence shows that many Roman towns simply ceased to exist during this period, not destroyed by invaders or abandoned gradually. They just stop, their populations vanishing like smoke. Villa complexes that housed hundreds now shelter wolves and weeds. The sophisticated urban culture that defined Romano-British civilization disappears so thoroughly that when people finally return to these areas, they build crude wooden structures in the shadows of stone buildings they no longer understand how to construct or maintain. Agricultural recovery proceeds with agonizing slowness. The soil, depleted by years of desperate over-farming and erosion, yields pathetic harvests even when the climate improves. Seeds are scarce. Many heritage varieties cultivated for centuries went extinct when the last farmers who grew them died. You're forced to rebuild agriculture from whatever random survivors remain, creating a genetic bottleneck that reduces crop diversity for generations. The sophisticated three-field systems and crop rotation patterns that maximized yields are forgotten, replaced by subsistence farming that barely keeps communities alive. Here's a detail that shows how long recovery takes. Tree ring data indicates that forest growth doesn't return to pre-536 levels until nearly 600 CE in some regions. That's 2 full human generations of stunted growth. The ecological damage cascades through every system. Depleted soils lead to weak plants, which support fewer animals, which provide less fertilizer, which further weakens the soil. It's a downward spiral that takes decades to reverse. Some ecosystems never recover their former diversity. Species that went extinct during the crisis, certain crops, livestock breeds, wild animals, are gone forever, leaving holes in the ecological web that alter how entire regions function. Political structures that emerge from the catastrophe bear little resemblance to what came before. The centralized empires that required complex administration and reliable communication are replaced by local strongmen who rule whatever they can personally intimidate. The concept of legitimate authority based on law or tradition gives way to pure force. You obey the local warlord not because any constitution says you should, but because he has more armed followers than anyone else. These petty kingdoms fight constantly over scraps, wasting resources that should go to rebuilding. The feudal system emerging from this chaos isn't a planned political development. It's what happens when civilization collapses so thoroughly that personal violence becomes the only remaining organizing principle. The knowledge gap created by the crisis proves nearly impossible to bridge. When literate administrators died en masse, they took with them not just the ability to read, but the understanding of why literacy mattered. The new rulers are predominantly illiterate warriors who see no value in maintaining schools or scriptoriums. Why fund monks to copy books when you need every resource for defense? The classical education that created sophisticated thinkers becomes a half-remembered dream. By 600 CE, finding someone who can read Greek in areas that were Greek-speaking 2 generations earlier becomes nearly impossible. Latin simplifies and fragments into regional dialects that will eventually become different languages entirely. Trade networks, once rebuilt, operate on entirely different principles. The credit systems and commercial law that enabled long-distance commerce are gone, replaced by immediate exchange and personal trust networks that extend no further than a day's travel. The concept of investment, putting resources into ventures that might pay off years later, remains alien to people who learned that long-term planning is folly. Markets operate on barter and immediate exchange. The sophisticated financial instruments that Romans took for granted won't reappear for centuries. It's economic primitivism born from traumatic memory. Why trust in future payment when the future might not exist? Social structures calcify into rigid hierarchies based on military power and land control. The social mobility that characterized the late Roman Empire, where merchants could become senators and talented individuals could rise through merit, disappears entirely. You're born into your station and will die there, as will your children and their children. The trauma of total social collapse creates societies obsessed with stability at any cost. Change becomes synonymous with catastrophe. Innovation is viewed with suspicion. Better to do things the way they've always been done, even if always means since the recovery began, than risk another collapse. The psychological scars run deepest of all. Entire cultures develop worldviews shaped by catastrophe, seeing history as decline rather than progress. The classical confidence in human reason and capability gets replaced by fatalism and superstition. Why study natural philosophy when nature itself can turn hostile without warning? Why build for the future when the past proved that everything can be destroyed? The optimism that drove classical civilization gives way to the medieval mindset. Life is suffering. The world is fallen. And the best you can hope for is survival until death brings release. It's not just economic or political regression. It's a fundamental shift in how humans see their place in the cosmos. So here you are in 2020. Probably reading this in a climate-controlled room with a full stomach and electric lights. Wondering what relevance a volcanic winter from 15 centuries ago could possibly have to your life. Let me spell it out for you. Everything about 536 CE should terrify you precisely because it demonstrates how quickly and completely civilization can collapse, not from nuclear war or alien invasion or any of the dramatic scenarios we imagine, but from a single environmental disruption that cascades through every system humans depend on. The Byzantines thought they were the eternal continuation of Rome. The Chinese thought the mandate of heaven guaranteed stability. They were all wrong, and their confidence evaporated as quickly as morning dew in hell. Modern climate scientists study 536 CE with the fascination of doctors examining a particularly virulent disease. The volcanic forcing that caused the crisis, roughly 15 to 20 teragrams of sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere, is well within the range of eruptions that could happen tomorrow. Tambora in 1815 was similar in scale and caused the year without a summer, but that hit a pre-industrial society with much lower population density. Imagine a similar eruption today, when 8 billion people depend on fragile just-in-time supply chains and industrial agriculture. The models are unequivocal. We'd see global agricultural yields drop by 10 to 20% for at least 2 years. In a world where food security already hangs by a thread, that's a recipe for catastrophe that would make 536 look like a practice run. Here's what really keeps researchers up at night. The interconnectedness that makes modern civilization efficient also makes it fragile. In 536, isolated communities could survive on local resources even as global trade collapsed. Today, your local supermarket has maybe 3 days of food inventory. Your city's water system requires constant electricity to function. Your home's heating depends on natural gas pipelines spanning continents. The Byzantine Empire took years to fully collapse because its systems had redundancy and regional self-sufficiency. Our civilization is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. When systems fail now, they fail fast and completely. The social lessons are equally stark. The veneer of civilization, all those laws and customs and moral principles we take for granted, is exactly that, a veneer. It took less than a year of famine for 6th century communities to abandon millennia of social development and resort to cannibalism. These weren't barbarians. They were sophisticated urban populations with complex legal systems and philosophical traditions. Yet when survival was at stake, they became worse than animals. Animals don't generally eat their own young. The comfortable assumption that we're somehow more civilized, more moral, more advanced than our ancestors is dangerously naive. We're the same biological creatures, just with smartphones. Climate change makes the 536 scenario particularly relevant. Not because global warming will trigger a volcanic winter, though geoengineering gone wrong could achieve similar results, but because any severe disruption to global climate systems could trigger similar cascading failures. The difference between 1, 5 and 3 degrees of warming isn't just about temperature. It's about agricultural zones shifting faster than crops can adapt, water systems failing, and hundreds of millions of climate refugees making the migrations of 536 look like a neighborhood stroll. The volcanic winter of 536 was at least temporary. The changes we're creating now are essentially permanent on human timescales. Perhaps most importantly, 536 demonstrates that collapse isn't evenly distributed. The wealthy and powerful suffer, but they suffer last and least. Emperor Justinian survived the plague. His subjects died in heaps. Chinese nobles retreated to fortified compounds while peasants starved. The patterns of who survives catastrophe and who doesn't are depressingly consistent across history. Today's billionaires building bunkers in New Zealand aren't crazy. They're students of history. They know that when systems collapse, money transforms from abstract numbers to concrete resources, food, water, weapons, and the people desperate enough to trade their freedom for survival. The recovery from 536 also holds lessons, though they're not encouraging ones. It took Europe 5 centuries to regain the level of urban development and literacy it had before the crisis. Some regions never recovered their pre-536 population levels. The knowledge lost during those dark years, from engineering techniques to philosophical works, represented thousands of years of accumulated human wisdom vanishing in a single generation. In our age of digital storage and cloud computing, we assume knowledge is permanent. But what happens when the power grids fail and the servers go dark? How much of our civilization exists only as magnetic patterns on hard drives that will be unreadable junk without electricity? The story of 536 CE is fundamentally about hubris, the dangerous assumption that because things have been stable in living memory, they'll remain stable forever. It's about the fragility of complex systems and the speed at which they can unravel. It's about how quickly humans can descend from philosophy to cannibalism when the alternative is death. Most of all, it's about the fact that civilization isn't an achievement unlocked permanently, but a continuous project requiring constant maintenance. Let it lapse, and darkness returns with shocking speed. But perhaps there's odd comfort in knowing our ancestors survived worse and eventually rebuilt. Not the same civilization that was gone forever, but something new that eventually surpassed what came before. The humans who lived through 536 couldn't imagine the world of 2025 any more than we can imagine what might rise from our ashes if we fail. The question isn't whether our civilization will last forever. No civilization ever has. The question is whether we'll be smart enough to learn from the past, or doomed to repeat it with nuclear weapons and climate change instead of volcanoes. History suggests betting on repetition is usually safe. But then again, maybe that's why it keeps repeating. And here, as the weight of history settles into your bones like volcanic ash, we begin our gentle return to your present moment. The sun that you perhaps took for granted this morning that reliable golden disk that has greeted you every day of your life, suddenly seems more precious, doesn't it? The full shelves at your local store, the turning of the seasons in their proper order, the basic assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. These aren't guarantees, but gifts that could be revoked by nature's casual cruelty at any moment. As your breathing naturally slows and deepens, let the images of that darkened world fade gradually, like a fever dream dissolving in dawn light. The desperate migrations, the empty cities, the frozen fields, they're sliding back into the past where they belong, though their lessons echo forward through time like ripples on dark water. Feel yourself returning to a world where the sun shines properly, where food exists beyond mere survival, where knowledge accumulates rather than vanishes. Your bed beneath you is soft and warm, a luxury that would have seemed impossible to those who shivered through the volcanic winter. The walls around you are solid and secure, not the crumbling ruins of abandoned civilizations, but the protective embrace of a functioning society. Each breath you take is clean air, free from volcanic ash and the smoke of burning libraries. These simple comforts, unnoticed in daily life, are the products of 15 centuries of slow recovery and patient rebuilding. Tomorrow, you'll wake to predictable sunlight and the ordinary miracles of modern civilization. But perhaps you'll notice them differently now, understanding how fragile these certainties really are, how quickly the unthinkable can become the everyday. And in that noticing, in that gentle gratitude for the stable world you inhabit, lies wisdom hard-won from humanity's darkest year. Let that knowledge settle into your unconscious mind like seeds in fertile soil, growing quietly through your dreams. Close your eyes now and let sleep take you. Not the desperate unconsciousness of starvation, but the peaceful rest of safety and plenty. The year 536 has finally ended, both in history and in our story. And you're here in your comfortable bed 15 centuries later. Proof that humanity endures even its worst nightmares. Sweet dreams, and may you wake to a sun that remembers how to shine.